to do one thing, please. Hold on one second. All right. Okay, well, I'd like to welcome everybody here this morning to our second webinar hosted by and sponsored by the Lake States Fire Science Consortium. My name is Charles Gable. I'll be moderating the webinar today. I'm the PI on the Lake States Fire Science Consortium project funded by the Joint Fire Science Program out of Boise, Idaho. We're very fortunate this morning to have two speakers to share with us some of their research on wildland fire and mercury contamination in soil and water. Those individuals are Randy Kolka and Trent Wickham. A couple of things before we get started here is just some reminders about the technology that we'll be using here with the GoToMeeting software. Your interface with the presentation today will be the GoToWebinar window that's in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. This is where you can interact with the presenters as well as me, and I'll be serving as the moderator for this webinar this morning. And so a couple things to remember. If the window is in your way of viewing things on the presentation and you want to minimize that, there is a red arrow at the top of that menu bar in that window that you can click. That red arrow, red box with the arrow pointing to the right-hand side will minimize that. And if you want to bring it back, all you have to do is click on that arrow that points to the left. And that will bring back the GoToWebinar window for you so that you can interact with us. If you have a question, please feel free to share that using the question tab that's in the GoToWebinar window. All you need to do is just type your question in the box, and there is a pull-down menu right below that that allows you to specify whether you want the entire audience to view that or if you only want the moderator to see that. And then I will be acting as that moderator, and at various times throughout the webinar today, I will be asking our presenters those questions. So if you have a question and you don't want to wait to the end, which is fine, just go ahead and type it in that question box and we'll get it to you and try to get an answer for you at some scheduled times where we have some natural breaks in the presentation. Okay. I'd like to introduce today our speakers, Randy Kolka and Trent Wickham, joint webinar. Randy holds a BS degree in soil science from the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point and a Master's of Science and PhD degrees in soil science from the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities. Following the completion of his PhD in 1996, he worked as a research soil scientist with the USDA Forest Service Southern Research Station at the Savannah River site in South Carolina. In 1998, he moved from the Savannah River site to the Department of Forestry at the University of Kentucky and served as an assistant professor of forest hydrology and watershed management. In 2002, he became team leader and research soil scientist with the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, which is where he is today. He is an adjunct faculty member at 5 universities and has published over 100 scientific articles in his research career. Trent Wickham, our other speaker here today, currently works with the U.S. Forest Service on the Superior National Forest. He's a native of northern Minnesota and the UP of Michigan, where he attended Michigan Tech in Houghton and received a BS in biology and then an MS in environmental engineering. After graduation in 1996, he worked as an air permit engineer for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency for 5 years, drafting and issuing air permits for new industrial sources. Since 2001, he has worked with the U.S. Forest Service as an air resource specialist, assessing the impact of air emissions from the industrial sources to forest resources, and also supporting prescribed burning operations through various smoke management agency activities. So with that, I'm going to pass the presentation and control over to Randy, and he'll begin the webinar. It's all yours, Randy.
All right. Yeah, I'm just watching the audience view. It looks like everyone can see my screen now. And just for everyone's information, including Charles, it's Wickman and not Wickham for Trent's last name. So glad everyone's here this morning. We're going to talk about the influence of fire on mercury today. And this is my first webinar, so there may be some burps and chugs and things in this presentation, but I'm trying to make sure that the view here is, everyone has the view that I'm looking at, so I think there will be a few pauses here and there as we go through it. Today we're going to talk about some of the background on mercury and the background on Mercury Research as sort of a primer to what we're going to talk about on fire effects on mercury. And so through the background, we're going to talk about some of the health risks, some of the sources and forms, and some of the landscape influences. The background is really what's the importance of mercury? Why do we even study it? The background of Mercury Research is a set of studies that I myself or others of my colleagues have been involved with that sort of sets the stage on what we know about mercury at this point in time in sort of non-fire conditions. And then finally, the last third or so of the presentation is going to be about actually what we know about how fire affects mercury cycling.
Hey, Randy?
Yes, Trent?
I think the only thing I would throw out there is for the people that it's been a while since they've been in the chemistry class. We probably picked it out already, but Hg is mercury. You see lots of Hg.
Very, very good, Trent. Thank you. So to start off, we're going to get to know a little about mercury. In the background, we're going to talk about some of the health risks, some of the sources and forms, and some of the landscape influences. Part of the issue with mercury is it bioaccumulates in the food chain. And that means that as one trophic level or one level of biota eats another level of biota, that whole burden goes into that next level of biota. So in this circumstance, we have what's in water, and the phytoplankton and zooplankton goes into the minnows, up into the frogs and the walleyes and the raccoons and the panthers and humans, of course. And it bioaccumulates to the point that it's about 1 million times more concentrated in these upper level predators than it is in the water. And there was some research not too long ago that thought that they found some bioaccumulation in not just the aquatic food chain, which is what we know a lot about, but also in the non-aquatic food chains. They've started finding some really high mercury concentrations in upland birds, forest-dwelling birds. And when they went and they looked at the diet of these birds, they found that spiders were a really important component of their diet. And of course, spiders, what do they catch a lot of? Well, one of the things they catch a lot of is mosquitoes. And so when they traced it all the way back, of course, mosquitoes are an aquatic insect, and so it really did still go all the way back to the aquatic food chain. So this is really an aquatic food chain web that we're talking about here with mercury bioaccumulation. So some of the health risks affects the nervous system. It affects reproductive systems. It affects their neural networks. It's bad stuff. There's been a number of cases of mercury poisoning in the past. Mad Hatter's disease, which you've probably heard of, with Alice in Wonderland, the Mad Hatter. Basically, they used mercury to tan hides for hats, and they breathed in and ingested that mercury. There was a poisoning case in Iraq in the 50s where they used to use a mercurial chloride to preserve seed. It was a sort of a fungicide to preserve seed before they planted it, and the truck or whatever that was going to be planted got mixed up with the truck that was going to the bakery, and they made a whole bunch of bread out of this mercurial chloride treated seed, and it killed about 3,000 people in Iraq. Minamata's disease is a really interesting case study. For the older ones of us that are on the webinar, we used to have these Polaroid pictures, and on the back of these Polaroid pictures there used to be this silver coating that used to be on those pictures, and there really wasn't a lot of silver. It was mostly mercury on the back of those pictures, and one of the places that created that coating was a place in Minamata, Japan, and those the output from those factories went right into Minamata Bay, of surface water body there in Japan, and really it bioaccumulated unbelievably in the food chain. And hopefully, as I've been talking, you can read the case there that they watched unbelievable suffering, and to the point where birds were falling out of the sky and cats were committing suicide. So it's a strange element and has some really big impacts on biota. Some of the most susceptible groups, as far as people go, are fetuses and young children, babies that are in the womb because they bioaccumulate from their mothers, the women up that childbearing age as well, and then folks that sustain themselves on fish, such as Native Americans, Asians, Alaskans, Pacific Islanders, etc. There's basically fish consumption advisories in every U.S. state, every Canadian province, and across Europe now. And in Minnesota, all surface water bodies have warnings for fish consumption advisories as a result of mercury. This is just to highlight, this is from the Pollution Control Agency in Minnesota. Minnesota is not different from probably any other state that's in this region that you're calling from. As you can see, just about every surface water body in the state, again, has warnings for mercury. I just picked this up because this is the watershed that I'm currently sitting in. Some of the larger water bodies and more important water bodies in the state of Minnesota are in our watershed, including Lake Mille Lacs, Leech Lake, Lake Winnipesaukee. This is the Mississippi River coming down into St. Paul. All of them have impairments as a result of mercury. Again, this is for Minnesota, but it's an example for the rest of the lake states. It's not uncommon. There's guidelines, general guidelines for lakes that they don't sample as often as they would want to develop lake-specific guidelines. So these are general guidelines for that one group of susceptible folks, pregnant women plan to become pregnant, and children under 15. If you go down to just the walleyes longer than 20 inches and northern pike longer than 30 inches, the recommendation is do not eat. So do not eat any fish, or any walleyes at least. And in Minnesota, that's a big deal, longer than 20 inches. Obviously, the bigger the fish get, the more accumulation they have of mercury. So walleyes shorter than 20 inches, right here, you can see you can have a meal a month, and it should be okay. For non-susceptible groups, that would be men and women not planning to become pregnant, walleyes and northern pike about a meal a week. Panfish pretty much unlimited. Where the state of Minnesota has enough information on specific, really important recreational lakes, they have done enough sampling where they can come up with lake-specific guidelines. And this is for a lake near to me and dear to my heart that I fish at a lot, Lake Winnipesaukee, or Big Winnie as we call it locally. For those susceptible groups of folks, the meal advice for Winnie, for walleye, is 1 meal a week. For northern pike, if they're bigger than 25, 1 meal a month. For panfish, yellow perch here at least, all sizes, 1 meal a week. For me, the general population, can pretty much eat anything I want unrestricted except for northern pike, 1 meal a week. So there's been a lot of sampling and a lot of investigation on mercury concentrations in fish and how that affects the health of folks, and these guidelines have developed as a result of that. So where does this stuff come from? Well, there's not a lot of natural sources. There is a mineral called cinnabar, which is mined, and where most of our mercury comes from in our barometers and thermometers and fillings from our dental fillings, etc. But those are really isolated places where there's a lot of mercury in one spot. So they also, as a result of volcanic mercury gases and such, come out of volcanoes. And then finally, the other place where there's quite a bit of mercury is in carbon deposits, like this coal deposit in Kentucky. You'll see in a little bit there is a real close connection between mercury and carbon. Mostly the sources of our concern are man-made sources or anthropogenic sources of mercury. It's basically the burning of those fossil fuels, gas, oil, and coal especially. And so where does that stuff come from? Power plants, for example, when they burn coal. Other fossil fuel combustion, so when you drove to work this morning, when you're burning your gas, you were emitting gaseous mercury out your tailpipe. And then there's some manufacturing sources, and those tend to have decreased over time. If you look at a somewhat dated output for the U.S., as you can see, the combustion of fossil fuels is the bulk of what goes up in the atmosphere, about 87%. And all these other things are smaller. One of the manufacturing processes that used to be a huge source of mercury in our part of the world was the paper producing industry. One of the things they use to make the paper nice and white is a mercurial kind of compound, and thankfully they've found out that they can use other sources or other ways to do that, and that's pretty much been taken out now. If you look at sort of worldwide where these anthropogenic sources are coming from, a big chunk of it is coming from Asia these days. It's unbelievable what kind of renaissance they've had as far as, well, it's not really a renaissance, it's new ability they basically, in the Industrial Revolution we had 25, 30 years ago, and it's almost unregulated over there. North America is still a pretty big source though at 9%. And going back to Asia, I was in Beijing a few years back, and you'd think this would be sunrise in this picture down at the bottom right, but it's not. It's, as you can see, at the sun level that it is out of my hotel room, it's actually about 10 o'clock in the morning. That's the kind of haze, that's the kind of industrial pollution that's going on in China and still is today. And of course, a lot of that has mercury in it. Sources and forms of mercury, everything, or just about everything that we are concerned with is atmospherically derived as a result of coming down in precipitation, either dry or wet deposition. Much the same way as we're concerned with acid rain. It's coming from the same sort of exact sources. And there's global sources. There's a global cycle where it gets way up in the atmosphere and it travels around the globe before it's deposited. There's also local sources, and one of those things happens to be fire that we'll talk about in a little bit. It's got a very complicated atmospheric chemistry that we won't go into. And there's sort of three forms. There's a gaseous form, there's an ionic form, and there's an organic form. And the organic form is called methylmercury, and that's the harmful one. That's the one that bioaccumulates in the food chain. The organic or ionic form, what we're going to call total mercury today, is the total amount of mercury that's out there. And the methylmercury is a percentage of that total mercury. So we're going to, at this point, talk about total mercury and methylmercury. Total mercury is ionic mercury. Methylmercury is the harmful part of that total mercury, or the organic form of mercury. Where in general in the landscape does methylmercury get produced? Again, that's the bioaccumulative form of mercury. It's in places where there's low oxygen and food for the microbes to convert the total mercury to methyl mercury. And so where we find that food, which is carbon in this case, is in wetlands and in some cases is lakes, bottoms of lakes and streams. And we'll dig more into that whole idea in a little bit. And so here's just a little information from a colleague of mine, Dave Griegel, who looked at a whole bunch of mercury studies and looked at how much methyl mercury is output in watersheds, and he compared that to wetland area. There's a pretty good relationship. So the higher amount of wetland area you have in your watershed, the chances are the higher amount of mercury, methyl mercury that's being produced in your watershed. So Charles, with that, I think that's a stopping point and sort of the introduction to what mercury is all about. At this point, I'm planning to go into some of the mercury research that sets up the fire research that we're going to talk about at the end. It's a good point for questions right now, perhaps, if there is any.
Yeah, we have one question. The previous slide there, can you explain why, if wetlands are filter agents in a landscape, that the amount of methyl mercury output would be higher with the amount of wetlands that you would have? It seems I think the question's getting at it would seem like it would be inversely related.
Yeah, so wetlands have a lot of great virtues, obviously. They are filters. They're flood, they're good for flood abatement. They're good for many things. But one of the things that they also provide the conditions for, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those exact conditions are, is for the microbes that do the methylation of mercury, they like it to be inundated and they like to have a lot of carbon. And any place in the landscape that occurs is in wetlands in this part of the world. And so in the case of mercury, it doesn't perform the same way it does for sediment or nutrients and things like that. Mercury is a different kind of chemical, and it's a result of the conditions in the wetland itself, the inundated conditions, the carbon that's there, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the sulfur that's there too. All three of those things come together in one spot in our landscape, and that happens to be wetlands in the bottoms of lakes and streams.
So would you say that the methyl mercury is being produced in the wetlands, or just accumulating in the wetlands as it moves through the landscape?
It's absolutely being produced in the wetlands.
Great. Okay.
Any other questions at this point?
I don't think so.
Trent, anything to add at the end of this?
No, good.
Okay. So for the next little bit, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research that we've done here in northern Minnesota and up in Ontario and some of the colleagues up there. And we'll dig in a little deeper on what we know about how mercury cycles through ecosystems. So we're going to talk about the hydrologic cycling of total mercury, the importance of snowmelt on mercury, budgets coming out of watersheds, influence of sulfate, and some of the controls at the watershed level on methyl mercury production, and then about where in the watershed this methylation occurs and where those hot spots are in some of these watersheds in northern Minnesota. Much like a lot of things, a lot of ions coming down from the atmosphere, mercury can come down in a couple of different ways. It can come down as part of dry deposition, which is particles or aerosols in the atmosphere that get stuck on vegetation and other things, and precipitation, snow and rain. Hits the forest canopy in our situation. We have forest here, and it washes the forest canopy off, and the stuff that comes through the leaves, the leaf material is called through fall, and the stuff that runs down the stem of the tree is called stem flow. And in our watersheds in northern Minnesota, we have an upland that surrounds a wetland. And our wetlands up here are peatlands, bogs, and fens. And specifically, one of the studies I'm going to talk about today is about a bog. Within the upland circumstance, you have deposition on top of the upland surface soil, which within the upland, top 10 centimeters or so can run off downhill towards the bog. Some of that can leach, get into the subsoil, which can also have runoff towards the bog, and some of it can leach and go into deeper sources. Within deposition to the bog itself, we have a zone around the bog that we call the lag, and this is going to be a really important concept as we go through what we've found here in northern Minnesota, the lag. Basically, you have runoff from the upland going to the edge of the bog, and you have runoff from the center of the bog, which is actually higher than the middle than on the edge. So water runs off from the center to the edge to this very active hydrologic zone around the bog called the lag. So it's getting some very different waters from the bog central, very low pH, very low nutrient, very low oxygen, very high dissolved carbon, which is part of the food sources here for the microbes, going to some relatively nutrient-rich, high pH, really good carbon sort of waters to eat, going into this zone right around the edge of the bog called the lag. And so if you're walking in the woods, if you walk into a true bog, you'll always get wet feet before you get dry. And that's the nature of the bog. It's higher in the middle than the edge. Water runs off the center to the edge, and upland waters run off to that edge. So that's really where downstream the lag coalesces in these systems to produce a stream that might ultimately go to a lake or another wetland or something else. And here's an example of one of the watersheds we have up here in northern Minnesota on the Marcel Experimental Forest. This is the S2 watershed. We have a whole number of watersheds up here in northern Minnesota where we do various experiments. This is one of our control watersheds where we've never experimented in it, other than taking readings for various things. Uplands are aspen birch surrounding the watershed, and the peatland, the bog, is a black spruce bog in the center here. Again, the center of the bog is higher than the edge, so upland waters are coming to this edge. Bog waters are also coming to this edge. This edge right here, all the way around, is the lag zone. It's just a very narrow zone, maybe 5 or 10 meters wide. And that's actually the source of water that comes out of the watershed right through here is the stream that exits the watershed. And so way back when I was a graduate student, we started tracking how total mercury moves through these watersheds of northern Minnesota. And we'll disregard the carbon part of the story for now, but one of the things that we found as far as coming down in atmospheric deposition, so we've got to catch up here, I guess. Starting out with this site, basically I characterized what was going on hydrologically through this cycle with mercury. And so we started out with deposition and talked about the lag and the bog and the upland, and we also have an opening. Up until that point in time, back in the late 1990s, we really didn't know that there was a lot of dry deposition related to mercury. And so if you compare the deposition in the open to what we did in the forest, in different forest conditions, you can see that the forest conditions, especially the conifer forests here in the lag and the bog versus the deciduous forest in the upland, captures a lot more mercury as a result of it scrubbing the atmosphere. And the conifers themselves, because the needle area is so huge compared to the deciduous species, scrub that atmosphere even more effectively than the deciduous species, the aspen birch. And so in conifer systems we get up to 3 times as much deposition as we get in the openings. And on a watershed scale, once you take the areas of all these put together, we got about twice as much deposition of mercury in the watershed than what anyone would have known if they just measured in the open. And that was a new concept back in the late 90s that we discovered. When you start looking at subsurface and surface runoff from the upland and the runoff from the bog and the amount of mercury that's resulting in that runoff, not surprisingly, the only point in time where we have a lot of surface runoff, and this isn't surface runoff in the truest sense, this is runoff in the upper soil layers. In most forests we don't really have surface runoff unless we have a lot of compaction for some reason, or a road or something. So this is in the upper 5-10 centimeters of soil. The only time we really have any of that runoff is in the spring during snowmelt. Subsurface runoff occurs at various times of the year, including in the spring during snowmelt, but even if we have some big events during the summer. But dominating the runoff and the mercury that's coming out of these watersheds is what's coming out in the bog. And so the bulk of the total mercury coming out of these watersheds is from that runoff that occurs from the bog out to the lag zone. And so if you do a mass balance on the watershed and you look at the sinks and sources, the canopy, no matter where you are, is a source of mercury because it's collecting all that dry deposition. It falls on the soil. The soil holds quite a bit of it, but a relatively large chunk of it also comes out of the watershed. And so if you do the whole mass balance on a watershed basis, and this is one watershed in northern Minnesota, but it's typical of many watersheds in the lake states, the watershed holds about 34% of what comes in, but the opposite of that obviously is about 66% of what comes in annually actually goes out the watershed. And if you look at the percentage of that mercury that's coming out of these watersheds up in northern Minnesota as a fraction between the peatland or the bog in the S2 case and the upland, in the S2 about 98% of what comes out of the watershed had resided in the peatland versus only 2% from the upland. And that's pretty much the same across a number of different kinds of watersheds at the Marcel experimental forest. So basically what's coming out of the watershed is really a result of what's happening in the peatlands and not the uplands, going back to the point that was made on the question earlier. One of the characteristics of mercury as it moves through watersheds and it moves through ecosystems is wherever carbon goes, you can assume that mercury is going. Carbon and mercury have a very tight affinity for each other. So in waters where you see really dark colored waters, tea colored waters, you can bet that the mercury load in those waters is pretty high too, and there's been a number of different studies that have compared color of water and amount of DOC, which is dissolved organic carbon, which is that yellow color in lake waters or stream waters, and fish, and the more carbon you got in the water, the higher the fish mercury is. And here's just an example of some of the streams leaving the watersheds at Marcel. Pretty good relationship with the particulate form of organic carbon and mercury, total mercury. So once we characterized the hydrologic fluxes of total mercury, we started looking more specifically at when it was happening the most and the controls on methyl mercury, which I'll start here. One of the things we were interested in is how important snowmelt was on the total annual mercury budget for both total and methyl mercury. And as you can see, northern Minnesota, that snowmelt peak is over maybe a 8 to 10 to 12 day span. So it's just a small portion of the year. However, that small portion of the year leads to about 33% of the annual total mercury flux and about 22 to 23% of the methyl mercury flux, just over that 12-day period. And this was in 2006. If you look at the upland runoff versus the peatland runoff, they're about equal sources of total mercury. So it was that time of the year where you saw that pretty significant flux of surface and subsurface runoff from that one figure. But if you look at just the methyl mercury, which again is the bad mercury, the bioaccumulative form of mercury, about 70 to 90% of it was coming from the bog during that snowmelt time. We also did an experiment. There had been a number of studies before us that have looked at small scales on how sulfate affects mercury, especially mercury methylation. And some of those studies indicated that sulfate also somewhat controlled how much mercury was being methylated in soils, both mineral soils and organic soils or in peatlands or in bogs. And we really didn't know why. The one theory is that the same microbes, the same bugs that reduce sulfur, that produce that stinky H2S rotten egg smell when you walk into a wetland, were the same bugs that also methylate the mercury in these systems. And so if they were the same bugs that methylate mercury, one would think if we added sulfate to a system that was starved in sulfate, didn't have a lot of sulfate, that we could stimulate those bugs to reduce that sulfur and do whatever they do, and we still don't know what that is, to see if we would get a response of methyl mercury. So in a fairly large-scale experiment in one of the peatlands at Marcel again, we added 4 times what we'd normally get in sulfate deposition to the downstream half of one of these bogs. And here's the outlet here. Here is a system by which we piped in water, and we injected sulfate into that loop, and we put it in sprinkler systems across the bog. And here's it actually in action out in the black spruce bog, sprinkling basically sulfate onto this bog. And so what do we find coming out of the outlet of the watershed? When we add 4 times sulfate to just the downstream 1/2 of that bog, we didn't do it over the whole watershed, we didn't do it over the whole bog, just the downstream half of the bog, we get about twice as much methyl mercury coming out of the watershed. And so this is what would have been predicted had we not added sulfate, the dotted line here, and this is what happened as a result of adding sulfate. And again, you add all that up and it's about twice as much. And so indeed, it appears like the bugs that are reducing sulfate in the soils, the ones that produce the rotten egg smell when you walk into one of those places, are the same bugs that are methylating mercury, although we really don't know the mechanism on how they do it. And so that led us into trying to figure out how we can dig even deeper on what's controlling methyl mercury production. Obviously, sulfate is part of that story, but carbon is also part of that because the microbes need carbon. So what we did is we put an experiment in another open peatland up at Marcel and tried to look at how carbon sources and sulfate influence mercury methylation in a mesocosm. And in our case, a mesocosm was just a wood box. That's what a fancy scientist calls a mesocosm. And so what we used was 5 different sources of carbon and 2 different levels of sulfate, and in a replicated way added them to these boxes. And what we found when we did that, when we added a number of different carbon sources, glucose, acetate, lactate, those are all just sugars. Glucose is the sugar in your cupboard right now. It's really available carbon. It's really edible to bugs. It's the most edible kind of carbon you can throw at a bug. And then we incubated some litter from conifers, and we incubated some litter from deciduous species, and we squeezed those leaves out, and we put some of that in there too to see if the natural sort of sources of carbon might also have an influence on how the bugs reacted. And if you look over to the side here, this is the day since we added that stuff, and the amount of methyl mercury produced. None of them had any influence on how much methyl mercury was produced. So what that tells us is these bugs in these peatland systems are not carbon limited at all. They got plenty of carbon. Maybe not surprising considering a peatland is just about all carbon, but by adding carbon, even really edible carbon, it didn't do anything for the bugs and produce methyl mercury. However, if we added sulfate again, we did the 4 times like we did with the watershed experiment, and we also did a 10 times deposition. You can see that both of them had a reaction. The bugs were definitely limited by sulfur again in this system. And it didn't really look like they were limited any differently between 4 times and 10 times. It looked like 4 times was plenty. Basically, it was the same relationship. However, were there synergistic effects between adding both carbon and sulfate? So when we added both of those things with glucose and acetate and 4 and 10 times sulfate, we got about twice as much methyl mercury produced as we did with just the sulfate. So once they become sulfur limited, or once they're sulfur limited and you give them to get the bug sulfur, they do become carbon limited. And if you give them both carbon and sulfur, they're loving it. they're loving it. They're producing methyl mercury like crazy. And the same can be said with different organic soups. They love the conifer soup and the deciduous soup. So there is a synergy there. Once they become, they're not carbon limited to start with. They're sulfur limited. Once you give them some sulfate, then they are carbon limited, and once they get a little bit of both, they are really producing methyl mercury. And so that led us to try to think about where in these landscapes good carbon exists, where sulfur exists, where mercury exists, and in forms that the microbes like. And so we did a bunch of sampling across the interface, going from the uplands through the lag zones that we talked about earlier into the center of the bog. And we looked at where the percent of methyl mercury was the highest as a result of a percentage of the total mercury. So the higher the percent methyl mercury, we considered that a hot spot where methyl mercury is being produced. And if you look at the edge of these peatlands, so here's two peatlands up in Ontario, Canada, here and here. And here's the edge of peatland at Marcel, S2, which we talked about earlier, and here's the S6 one that actually had the sulfate deposition experiment on it. You can see where the bulk, based on the size of the dots and the color of the dots, where the bulk of the methylation is occurring, where the biggest percentage of total mercury is methyl mercury. And you can see pretty clearly here that it's on the edges. And so what are the edges of these places? Where those are those lag areas we talked about earlier. And so they're getting everything they need in those lag areas, and these lag areas really appear to be hot spots in these landscapes. So to summarize what we sort of know about mercury as a result of studies here in northern Minnesota and other places, dry deposition is really an important part of mercury deposition. Forest canopies are sources of mercury while soils are sinks. Hydrologic transport of mercury is driven by peatland or bog fluxes. Carbon fluxes are a good predictor of mercury fluxes. Snowmelt period accounts for a pretty significant proportion of the annual flux. And overall, thankfully, our watersheds are generally sinks for mercury. We are accumulating mercury, but does that mean we're just building up reserves for future transport? Influence of sulfate, 4 times sulfate equaled about twice the amount of methyl mercury being produced in the watershed. Thankfully, because of Clean Air Act and a number of different other regulations over the last 30, 40 years, sulfate deposition is decreasing in most places. And this is the sulfate deposition for the Marcel experimental forest since the late 70s. And you can see that it's a quarter of what it used to be back in the early 70s. So that's a good thing that sulfate deposition is decreasing, because that certainly is affecting the methyl mercury being produced in our watersheds. But we still need to be careful where we build places where we might have sulfur coming out of smokestacks. Controls on methyl mercury production. Looks like the microbes don't appear to be carbon limited. Only after we give them some sulfate do they appear to be, however, they do appear to be sulfate limited, and only after adding sulfur do they become carbon limited. When we combine both, we get about twice the methylation of just the sulfate alone. And then finally, the lag, that's the hot spot in these landscapes on where methyl mercury is being produced. And so that was sort of a primer on the research up here as far as what we know about natural cycles, I guess, anthropogenic cycles, I guess I would say, of mercury. That leads us into the research that Trent and I and others have developed looking at the effect of fire on some of these processes. And so with that, I think I'll stop again, Charles, for any questions related to what I just presented there.
Great. We do have a couple questions, Randy. The first would be, what is the role of pH in regulating the cycling of methyl mercury? I believe I'm trying to capture that question.
That's a good question. Others' research, not ours, but research that's been done in other places indicate that there's a sweet spot of pH, so to speak. Once pH gets too low, below 3.5 or 3, like it can get in some of these bog systems in this part of the world, it inhibits methylation. pH gets above 7, 7.5, 8, also inhibits methylation. So there's a sweet spot somewhere in the 4 to 5.5, I would say, range, where it seems like those bacteria survive the best.
Okay. And then another question here, your hotspot map that you presented a few slides back. There wasn't a consistent hotspot as far as the entire lag around those wetlands that you showed as far as those maps were concerned. Is that related to, yeah, so that slide there, is that related to perhaps the flow of water and how water is moving across those systems? So for instance, in W658 there in the middle one, it's only on the left-hand side of that lag, not the right-hand side.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Charles. You know, even within the lag zone itself, there's a lot of variability in the way the water flows through those systems. So, and one of the things we actually are starting to look into is a question related exactly to this. Where you have concave hill slopes draining to that lag zone, we hypothesize that you have a lot more methylation occurring there because the fraction of the upland water that's going there is higher than a convex hill slope leading into the lag. And we think it's really where the upland waters are getting into these places is where the methyl mercury is being produced, because it's got really edible carbon coming down from the upland. It's got sulfate. It's got everything you need that's mixing in that lag zone. So my hypothesis would be where these dots are related to where there's concave hill slope features versus convex hill slope features.
Okay. One more question. What do we know about soils that are not histosols, but rather moderately well-drained or wetter and have thick organic horizons? Do they play a role in the methylation of mercury as well?
We'll get to a little bit of that when we get to the fire part of the talk, but in general, sort of non-wetland soils, there really isn't a lot of methylation that occurs in non-wetland soils, even if there's quite a bit of organic carbon. There's certainly a lot of mercury stored in that organic carbon from past deposition, but there's not a lot of methylation that occurs. As soon as you get in the soils that are towards the wetter end of soils, not necessarily organic soils, but maybe wet mineral soils that have a significant amount of carbon in the surface, then you really start to see the methylation. So it's really the inundation that's important. It's not so much the carbon that's important, as far as the methyl mercury production, not the total amount of mercury burden in the soil.
Okay, great.
Does that make sense?
I think so.
Hey, Randy, I would just add, maybe to drive that point home, you could maybe comment about what happens when a reservoir is created and you have all that mercury stored in an upland area and it goes underwater.
Yeah, so there's been some really neat studies up in Canada where they've created reservoirs for hydroelectric power, and they needed to, flood lots of different kinds of soils, and peatland soils, but also upland soils in some cases. And once you flood those systems and you give it the conditions that the methylators like, the sulfate reducers like, the same, and again, it's the same bugs. The load of methyl mercury that comes out of those systems after you flood them was just amazing. They had unintended consequences that they never would have, they've never thought of it when they started flooding some soils up in Ontario, especially some of the studies there.
Okay, I think that's good.
So Trent's going to take over now for a couple of slides and sort of reiterate sort of what we know about the pathways of mercury in the environment, and then I'll take over again after that point. We'll talk about some of the research, and then Trent will finish up the talk talking about some management implications. So Trent, I'll give it over to you here.
Okie dokie. As Randy said, this is also my first time on this, so hopefully things will go great. All right. Okay, let's see. Unfortunately, okay. Sorry, I wasn't keeping up with Randy. Okay, here we go. All right. So yeah, I'm gonna. Can you guys? All right, you got my screen.
We do. We're good.
All right. I'm going to just kind of go and touch on, again, some of the things that Randy was talking about before, and just to kind of get them, again, maybe more at a 10,000-foot level. And I appreciate everybody's patience with going through some of the science. But really, if you don't first have a basic understanding of the mercury cycle, it's really hard to get a sense for, well, where does fire fit into all this? Because you really need to see the whole thing first. So, are you guys able to see my my pointer or my hand here on the screen there, Charles?
What I'm seeing is actually your screen locked up when you went to full screen mode.
All we got's the hourglass right now. It looks like it's trying to load or something.
Okay. Well, you can see you can still see the slide, right?
We can,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. Well, I'll try to talk through it here then. But anyways, so if you look at the slide that I've got up, in the sources Randy's mentioned of mercury is generally from the atmosphere, and although there are some natural sources, again, we focus a lot on the industrial sources. And Randy had mentioned before that mercury comes in different forms, and each of those forms acts differently. Each of it has different chemical characteristics which affect the fate once those are emitted into the environment. It also affects how easily they're controlled at a source. For example, what kind of pollution controls they have on at a certain source may help control mercury, or it may not, depending on the form of mercury that's emitted. Won't get too much into that, but as you can see, once it's emitted from the industrial source, then it goes and it can be deposited, as Randy talked about, into the landscape. And you have different ways that happens, and we'll get in a little bit more details on the upland soils. It was a good question, kind of a segue to start talking a little bit of the upland soils. And then, as was mentioned, the key part is, even though a lot of this mercury is deposited, it can be held in the soils and be there for quite some time if it's an upland situation. And really, the action doesn't start happening until it gets methylated. And as Randy's talked quite a bit about, that's a biological mechanism. And there was a while, and it took a while for folks to realize that this is a biological issue, whereas I think a lot of people were used to the acid rain problem and we're coming at it from a chemistry standpoint. And while chemistry is important for some parts of the cycle, this methylation step is a biological step. And then we talked about, you get from there, you go into the fish as it works up the food chain.
Trent, sorry to interrupt, but we're getting some feedback from the audience that they're having a little bit of trouble hearing you, so if you could speak up a little more, that would be great.
Charles, should we try to have him load the slide again so he can?
I think that would be a good idea as well.
Why don't you try that one more time, Trent, just to see if you can get your slide completely loaded and you can have the clicker.
Well, let's see here. Show my screen.
That's better. Now I see the forced mercury cycle.
Okay.
Yep.
Do you see
That's better. Yep.
Do you see my little pointer?
Yes, we can.
Yep.
Okay. Well, let me go back and do the quick review then, since you guys didn't hear me exactly. It sounds like I was cutting out a little bit. But this is louder now to your guys' ears?
I think it's good for my end.
Okay. So I'll try to do this again just real quickly. As I mentioned before, we focus on the industrial sources, even though there are natural sources. There are different species emitted, different type chemical forms of mercury, and each one acts differently and chemically, and that causes it to have a different fate, not only in the environment, but also in how easily it may be controlled at an industrial source by existing pollution control equipment. And then as that's emitted, it is deposited in different ways, as Randy talked about, and we'll focus a little bit here on the upland soils and how that deals, or how that's held. But again, if there's significant carbon, or the carbon in those soils will hold the mercury, and that's a chemical mechanism, absorption mechanism there. It may be there for quite some time, but where all the action happens is when it's transported to an area where the methylation step can have. And again, that's a biological step, and that's where Randy was talking quite a bit about those microorganisms and what those microorganisms need as far as environment to live in. Where they are, that's where the methylation step happens. And then once you get it methylated, you move into the food chain. So again, this is just kind of a 10,000-foot kind of summary, maybe, to kind of drive home some of the points that Randy had talked about before. And again, like I mentioned before, I appreciate your patience in looking at this cycle, because you need to understand the cycle to be able to understand how fire fits into this. So with that, I'll move on to the next slide. And here we're going to kind of zoom into the forest. We're going to zoom into the upland part of the forest, and now we're going to start thinking about fire. So if you look at this, this is a kind of a breakdown of the different ways that mercury flows or flows in the upland environment. And Randy touched on a couple of these already. He talked about in his research where they had an open collector. So if you put a collector out in a field and there were no trees around, in this example here, the amount of deposition is 10, and we don't have to be involved with the units there, micrograms per meter squared per year, but the number you see is 10. But obviously then when you look under the trees, and Randy talked about how trees, and these look like deciduous trees, but he mentioned that conifer trees are even more efficient because of the surface area involved. They can pull a lot of the mercury out of the air, and then that gets washed off. In that combination, you can see the number under the trees, you get even more deposition. This is 17 in this example. And so once you have the, if you have that, you also, another way that mercury gets deposited to the soil is through litter fall. Mercury can be incorporated right in the leaf tissue. It comes right in through the stomates, and it's incorporated in the leaves, and so when the leaves fall, it's another pathway for mercury to reach the soil. And so you have all these different pathways of mercury going to the soil. You know, mercury, as Randy said, is a really weird chemical. It's got a lot of different ways it can move, and another way it can be actually revolatilized back into the atmosphere. So you see there's a pathway going back to the atmosphere for the mercury. And so when you put all those things together, what you'd have, and like Randy highlighted before, is you have a net storage in the soil from the mercury coming from the atmosphere. And you'll see off to the bottom left here, there's an arrow that shows that some of this mercury that's stored in the soil will erode, or whatever term you want to use, will be delivered off-site each year. So some small amount will be delivered off-site. And if that delivery off-site goes to a spot that is efficient for methylating, and Randy talked about those environments, those anaerobic environments, be them wetlands or sediments, lake sediments, then you can have methylation, and you contribute to a mercury and fish problem potentially. So now with that introduction, if you think about this cycle and you look at it and think about what happens if we run a fire through here, how do all these little arrows that we talked about change? And then the question is going to become, I think a lot of the people that are out there are going to say, well, what kind of a fire do we have? Are we talking about just a light surface fire, or are we talking about a stand replacement fire? And I think this is where some of the complication immediately gets in. Some of the complication that we are trying to deal with in some of the studies we're looking at is that no fire is the same, and each fire is unique. But you can think about this looking at this chart, is that if you had a surface fire come through there, you didn't really affect the overstory, maybe things wouldn't change too much. What they've found is that mercury that's burned, any of the mercury in the soil that gets burned, will be volatilized and delivered potentially off-site, although some of it could be in a particulate form and could fall nearby, and maybe potentially fall on a nearby lake. But you know, some of that pool of mercury would be delivered off-site. And the question then becomes, is that soil more erodible now after that fire or not? Again, that's a fire intensity question. So then the flip side is, if we're not having a surface fire, say we're having a big stand replacement wildfire, and all the trees are slicked off, and it's a big fire. Now what changes? Think about it. Now you don't have litter fall anymore. You don't have through fall, at least for a number of years. So maybe the delivery of mercury to the soil over the long term, well, at least for until the forest starts coming back, is less. But obviously on a deep, severe fire, you burn most of the soil, most of the organic matter, so that pool is gone potentially. You've almost wiped the slate clean with a fire like that. So then the delivery downstream probably would be less, depending on how much is left, if any. But your delivery may be more. So you can see there's a lot of counteracting possibilities here, depending on fire intensity. And this, I guess, is with this slide and this discussion, I'm trying to set up for you now some discussion that Randy's going to have, talking about some of the monitoring programs that we've had to look at this question in the boundary waters. So, is there anything there you want to add to that, Randy?
No, I think I can go into my talk, so why don't you send it back to me.
Okay, it should be going your way.
I think we see your slide, Randy.
Okay, it says that now it looks like everyone can see my slide. Okay. And so that was a good setup, Trent. And so we've started looking at the effects of fire on mercury cycling about 4 or 5 years ago now up in the Boundary Waters Canoe area and among other places. And I'll tell you why in a minute. But some of the important research questions that we wanted to answer is, how does burning influence deposition, especially local deposition? Is there a little extra chunk of mercury that gets deposited as a result of right after fire, and can that bioaccumulate in the food chain, basically? And then, does fire have any long-term effects on forest floor and soil mercury? And do these long-term effects have any influence on long-term sort of concentrations in aquatic biota? And again, in our situation here, we're mostly talking about fish. And specifically, the fish that we're talking about in our case is first-year-old, one-year-old perch, young-of-the-year perch. So, as a lot of folks probably know, there was quite a blowdown event that occurred in the Superior National Forest in the Boundary Waters Canoe area in July 4th, 1999. There was a blowdown event that actually went across southern Canada and all the way back up in the northeast U.S. It was quite a storm. In the Boundary Waters, it blew down about 200,000 hectares. And in one of the studies that we developed, and matter of fact, it was a study supported by the Joint Fire Sciences Program, who's supporting this seminar. We selected 5 watersheds that didn't get burned, or 5 watersheds that didn't get blown down versus 5 watersheds that we anticipated to be prescribed burn by the Superior National Forest. And since about 2005, we've been measuring mercury in soil, precipitation, through-fall, lake water, and fish, again, young-of-the-year perch. And there's also some associated studies by a colleague of ours in Voyageurs National Park that will be relevant in this story.
Just one note there, Randy. I wouldn't say that the controls weren't blowed down. They were just not going to be burned. They were nearby, but not going to be burned.
Okay. And so here's an example of same piece of ground before the storm versus after the storm. Pretty dramatic. And so if we look at some of our colleagues' work leading up to some of these studies, there has been a relationship found between deposition of mercury and mercury in fish. Study up in Ontario at the Experimental Lakes area, and just north of here, about 2 hours actually, Grand Rapids, added mercury to the lake and the watershed once a year for 3 years, and looked at that response to various parts of the food chain and the water and sediment. And I'm just going to focus on YOY perch, which is young-of-the-year perch, the same type of perch that we monitored in our study. And that's this right here, this symbol. And so after 1 year, there was a small percent increase, maybe about 5%. After a second year, there's about 20% increase. And up here, there was close to a 40% increase, or 30% increase, I guess, in concentration as a result of these additions. So the higher the deposition, the more mercury you put on a watershed in a lake, it does bioaccumulate in the food chain. It's been shown up in Ontario.
Excuse me,
so in our study,
Randy, I'll just
go ahead,
jump in real quick. Just to mention, Randy's talked about young-of-the-year perch, and you may be wondering, why are we monitoring young-of-the-year perch when people probably care more about game fish? Well, the issue is that we're trying to monitor at a part of the food chain and see that impact sooner, basically, than wait until it gets to the top of the food chain. So that's, I know, one reason. I don't know if you want any other comment related to that, but I just thought I'd throw that out there in case people were wondering.
Right. So what Trent's point is that you know, if you put an extra slug of mercury into a body of water, it'll take years, if not maybe even up to a decade, for it to find that slug in higher trophic levels. But if you sample something that's at the very bottom of that food chain, where that new mercury that's getting put in is bioaccumulated quickly, you might be able to detect that change quickly, and that's why we're trying to monitor something that's very early in the food chain, as in young of the year perch. Good. Well, so what did we find in the boundary waters as far as deposition? We just saw that if we add mercury to a watershed in a lake, it will bioaccumulate in the food chain. And so we put out collectors across the boundary waters, and we had, I think it was 2 wildfires and 1 prescribed fire, if I remember right, Trent. And we collected water coming through the canopy as far as throughfall. And if you look at the pre-burn concentrations of total mercury and methyl mercury, relatively low, I guess, in comparison to the first collection after the burns, where we had this blip of mercury, both total mercury and methyl mercury coming in. And even after the second collection post-burn, which we're talking about 10 to 15 days for the first collection, maybe another 10 to 15 days for the second collection after that, so up to maybe 20, 30 days, we still had higher methyl mercury than we did pre-burn, although total mercury is about the same. And then finally it took to the third collection after fire where we didn't have any differences anymore. So this blip right here that occurred the first month or so after fire increased annual deposition about 30 to 40% in that 1 year of those watersheds. Now relating deposition to soils, and then soils to watersheds, and finally mercury and fish, starting with relating deposition with soils here. Higher mercury deposition leads to higher mercury in soil. That's probably not surprising. This is a transect going from northern Minnesota all the way to sort of southeast Michigan. And so there's an industrial sort of trend here that overlays what we found in the soil. The percent increase in mercury content in the soil is the second bar here. And it's sort of low at the beginning of the transect, but certainly gets higher towards the end of the transect. And so it unequivocally shows that there is an increase in deposition in soil mercury across the deposition gradient as mercury deposition increases. And some of the studies we've been working on recently, there's really a strong relationship between mercury and soil organic matter. First in the forest floor. And then secondly, in the A horizon, or the upper mineral horizon of soils, the carbon-rich mineral horizon. And so how does fire affect those O and A horizons? Certainly, depending on the intensity of the fire, which Trent mentioned earlier, it can certainly affect the forest floor, and even more intense fires can affect the carbon in the A horizon. So is there a relationship between what's in the soil and what's in the fish in the watersheds? Well, we certainly have found that in the boundary waters. You can predict the amount of mercury in young of the year perch with about 79% confidence if you know how much organic matter is in the O horizon. And that confidence decreases a little bit. You're a little more disconnected, I think, from the hydrologic flow paths in the A horizon, but you still have pretty good confidence in predicting fish mercury with A horizon organic carbon or organic matter, 64%. You start getting below that where you don't have as much carbon in the soil anymore, and the prediction goes away. So it's really those upper 2 layers of the soil, the organic rich layers of the soil, that appear to be controlling how much mercury is getting into the lake, as well as the deposition directly to the lake, obviously. But longer term, it appears like the soils in the watershed are controlling fish concentrations of mercury. And so again, what happens to that carbon in the forest floor following fire? Here's a study that we're working on as we speak, looking at the blowdown area of the boundary waters in the Superior National Forest. Actually, this is outside the boundary waters, where we have treatments of blowdown and salvage logging and fire, blowdown and fire, and just fire, and then just blowdown, and then we have a reference system. As you can see, the 3 sort of fire treatments have the least amount of carbon left in the forest floor, much less than the blowdown itself without fire. And at least some of those treatments are similar to the reference, but certainly the combination of blowdown, logging, and fire is less, and statistically less, than these other treatments. So fire appears to obviously affect the amount of carbon in the forest floor. And not surprising, that same trend is visible for mercury, because again, carbon and mercury sort of go together. And so if we got less mercury in the forest floor and A horizon after fire, one would think that over time, since fire, that accumulation would increase. And certainly in a recent study by some colleagues of Trent and I's, Laurel Woodruff and a group from USGS has looked not only in the Boundary Waters Canoe area, but in the Voyageurs National Park, the same part of the world up there. They've looked at the amount of mercury in soils, and in this case the A horizon of soils, and time since fire. And so most recent fires, we have really low mercury in A horizons. And as time goes on, or goes back since fire, you can see the accumulation pattern of mercury as a result of deposition, basically. And so it takes hundreds of years to refill the mercury pool following fire, it appears. Long term, does that lower mercury concentrations in fish? We really don't have an answer to that yet, but one would certainly hypothesize that. So just to summarize the fire effects on the mercury cycle, fire may cause a short-term increase in aquatic biota as a result of the blip in deposition that we measured, as shown in that one slide where the very first sampling after fire, we had an increase in both in total and methyl mercury. So there is a blip in that 1 year following fire. Does that manifest itself in the food chain? We're still working on that. We're still collecting fish. We're still burning watersheds, prescribed burning watersheds on the Superior, and we're getting close to that answer. Hopefully in a couple of years, maybe we can come back and give you more information on that. Just for a little bit more background, there has been 3 other studies that have looked at fire and the effect on the aquatic biota. Again, fish in this case. The first one's actually zooplankton and northern pike. And when they compared burned and unburned watersheds, they didn't find any statistical differences in zooplankton or northern pike up in Ontario, but the northern pike were about 1.6 times higher in burned watersheds. They just weren't statistically significant. One study up in Alberta found 5 times higher mercury concentrations in rainbow trout in burned watersheds than unburned watersheds, so pretty conclusive there. Another study, however, in Alberta didn't find many differences in aquatic biota when they compared burned and unburned watersheds. So it's only been a few places this has been tested, and the results are kind of on both sides of the fence right now. Longer term, it appears that both deposition and watershed soil storage influence mercury and biota. Deposition certainly does. Watershed soil storage is more of a hypothesis at this point. Certainly fire does decrease watershed soil storage of mercury. That we've shown. And over the long term, we might hypothesize that fire decreases that mercury and biota as a result of lower burdens in the soil, watershed soils. But like I said, we still don't have any studies to support that hypothesis. So one last summary slide here before we get to some management implications. Certainly fire leads to increased mercury deposition in downwind areas following fire. Our studies indicate that deposition is 30 to 40% of annual deposition. Question still remains, again, reiterating from before, can we pick that 40% up in the food chain from that one single year of fire? We should know that in a couple of years, hopefully. And I'll turn it over to Trent to finish this up.
Thanks, Randy. So I get the enviable, or I should say unenviable, job of trying to tell you what does this mean to you as a fire practitioner. I assume a lot of people out there are fire practitioners, fire managers. You know, and as Randy was saying, when you're talking about impacts on mercury from say prescribed burning, and that's kind of what I'm thinking about. You know, there's the short-term impacts, and then there's the long-term impacts, and Randy kind of went through both of those just before there. You know, you could argue that there could be a short-term increase potentially, and then on the longer term, you know, maybe there's a decrease, and so but a lot of these things are very uncertain, and You know, when I think about this mercury problem, I think of the, I believe it's the Cat in the Hat book. My kids are a little bit older now, but I remember reading the book where, a Dr. Seuss book, where they have that, they got that pink stuff they're trying to clean up in the house, and they try to clean it up, and then it ends up on their towel, and then they try to clean the towel, and it ends up somewhere else, and then it gets spread all over outside. And this is kind of what we're doing here. When you think about it, we have this landscape it's covered with mercury from deposition, of decades of deposition, and what we're doing is moving it around. And you know, we didn't ask for it, but we're all part of the society that deposited it, and how are we going to move it around is sort of the case, and how do we talk about that. So anyways, so I tried to pull together some thoughts here on management implications. The first point I wanted to make was that, you know, a lot of times I think researchers think about fire treatments, and they say, okay, here's a fire treatment in this study, and here's another fire in this study. But as we all know, fire treatments are not equal, you know, and every fire is unique. And are we talking about a stand replacement, very dry, very severe fire? Are we talking about a light surface fire? The impacts to the cycle, mercury cycle, would be quite different depending on which one we're talking about. So that's what I think is going to be leading to difficulty sometimes in trying to extrapolate results from some studies to other areas. Understanding that. I think the bigger thing that we need to think about, and working here on the National Forest System side, I understand we have to write NEPA documents, for example, and talk about the impacts of our management. But when you think about that, and you think about what you need to write as far as maybe impacts from a fire, prescribed burn you're planning, you also need to put in context of what's the natural role of fire in that ecosystem. And it goes back to the question that I know gets brought up a lot. You can't just assume that if you don't burn, everything's going to be hunky-dory and it'll just sit there, because a lot of these are fire-adapted ecosystems. So if we don't burn, what else could happen? And I think you really need to think about, you know, is this a system that if we don't burn like we want to, that we're going to lead to a higher risk of a wildfire? And if that's the case, then what are the impacts? And so it's always, I think, important to put that into context. Lastly, the last thought that I have is as Randy has talked about a number of times, is that, you know, the mercury ties to the carbon, and the carbon, you know, basically the soil. And we, you know, in an upland situation, for a lot of reasons, we have, many agencies have best management practices, or they focus on trying to avoid erosion, trying basically to keep the dirt on the land and not have it end up in the waterways. And if you already have those sort of programs going on, those are very good programs to mitigate mercury issues, because if you can keep the mercury, you know, in the upland areas, as Randy said, those tend to be not areas where they're going to methylate. You know, that's a pool of mercury that could end up somewhere, but as long as we're not enhancing the delivery of that mercury from an upland area into an area where it can be methylated, you know, I think we're doing a good thing. So, you know, these are just my thoughts. There's no book or there's no paper to go to where anybody's really tried to put this in the context of management for national forests or other agencies, but these are just some thoughts, some personal thoughts that I've had. So anything that I missed on that you'd want to add, Randy? Or I guess we're at the end here too, so this would probably be the time for questions too, Charles.
I don't have anything to add, Trent. Let's go to questions from Charles, if there's any. Okay,
yeah, we have a few. So taking these in the order that they came through, following up with the point about BMPs here. So the question is, do you think that adding a riparian buffer 50 feet to even 200 feet in a prescribed fire would make a difference in the short-term effects to aquatic biota post-fire in that watershed?
You want to tackle that one, Trent, or should I take a shot first?
Well, you know, I guess when I hear that, I think about, okay, riparian. Well, the first thing that I think about is, with my experience in fire, and as you heard, I don't have a long experience in fire, but my general assumption based on what I've seen is that when we're doing a prescribed burn, we don't tend to burn into the wetland areas. I mean, the fire just doesn't carry in there. And so I'm thinking a riparian buffer, I guess the function of that would be to capture some of the soil or other things that may erode and to prevent it from getting into a stream, and it would be delivered to a lake or something. And I guess from that mechanism, that seems to make some sense. But that's as far as my thoughts goes, Randy. So maybe you were thinking something else.
No, I think that's part of it. I guess when I think about what happens in a watershed during fire, I think about a certain chunk of mercury is going up in the atmosphere as particulates as a result of soot and smoke, and a certain portion of that, no matter where it resides from the watershed, is probably going to get deposited on the lake or near to the lake. And so that's one part of what maybe gets into the lake and the aquatic biota. The second part has to do with what Trent was saying. And following fire, the ash, especially that's left over, is pretty high in mercury. So a lot of it goes to the atmosphere, but the ash is also pretty high. And that ash, once the next rainstorm occurs, really gets dissolved pretty readily in the rainwaters and percolates into the soil. And those, you know, given the size of the storm or whatever, can have a pretty big influence on lateral transport down the hill slope into the wetlands and near lake environments as well. And so maybe there might be erosion as a result after fire, and then that's certainly a place where I think riparian zones can filter out stuff that's going down to the lake. But in other cases, I'm not sure it's the prescribed end-all to keep mercury out of the lake following fire.
Okay, so a follow-up to that, Randy and Trent, would be, so along with those BMPs for forest management operations, and should we also be working to mitigate the sources of those mercury emissions from industrial activities?
Absolutely. That's part of my job.
And you know, there's been a lot of regulations. Again, going back to the Clean Water Act, when we started really thinking about acid rain, or the Clean Air Act, I should say, that have helped try to decrease mercury coming out of smokestacks. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of good technology that's been able to scrub the mercury coming out of smokestacks, as there has been for sulfur and nitrogen oxides and other things. And so the deposition in some parts of the U.S. is going down to some degree, but nothing like the sulfate deposition slide that I showed you earlier. We still don't have the technology to take it out of the atmosphere of those smokestacks as much as we'd like to have yet. So deposition, although acid rain deposition is decreasing, mercury deposition is not decreasing in a big way right now still.
And so
yeah, sorry, Charles, I'll just add a little bit on to the end of that. There was a proposal about, towards the end of the Bush administration, to limit mercury from power plants nationwide under a cap-and-trade program. It was thrown out by the courts, but we're on the cusp right now of a new program that would deal with power plants, which are by far the largest source. And carbon is being, as we talked about, carbon being such a great thing for absorbing mercury in the environment, it also works in stacks. And in Minnesota, two of the largest power plants have put on carbon capture, and it's really, it's proven enough now that the large-scale installation is going to happen in the next probably 5 to 10 years. So I think that big drop you saw that Randy showed in sulfur is going to be coming for mercury. And then the question is going to become, from an impact standpoint, how much of the deposition that we see here locally is local versus, you know, China, and so how much of an effect will that have on the fish? You know, people argue about that all the time, but we'll find out, because these reductions are going to happen, and they have started to be implemented. I know that there's also a program in Wisconsin and Michigan too there's local in addition to the federal for power plants.
And so just to clarify here, the sources of the sulfates are almost entirely industrial. Are there any from mining operations?
Nothing major. Almost all from industrial burn of coal. Okay.
Got a couple more questions here. So one dealing with human health here. So have there been any studies or any evidence of the effect of mercury that's volatilized and inhaled by prescribed fire practitioners?
None that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I've never heard of any.
Would you think that that's a potential health risk at the levels of possible inhalation?
I would think not. Again, it's more, the historical tragedies that have occurred as a result of mercury have been bioaccumulation in the food chain, and in some cases absorption through the skin, which is what happened with the Mad Hatter's disease. I'm not aware of any health risk that's ever been published or that I've seen dealing with inhalation of volatile mercury. Maybe, well, I shouldn't say that. There was a woman working in a lab in the Northeast, one of the Ivy League schools, if I remember right, that was doing some mercury work, and she was poisoned somehow with I don't know. She had high levels of mercury that she was working with inside of a hood, and there was no ventilation for whatever reason, and she did get pretty sick as a result of inhaling mercury, but that was an extreme circumstance, I believe. So I don't think there's a major risk there.
Okay. Two more questions that more deal with, I think, the influence of fire mercury in wetlands and groundwater. So question is, what about issues with mercury where we are actively burning in wetlands as a tool for management, restoration, and the like?
Trent, you want to speak to that one first?
Well, I guess if you go back to that slide that we had, I guess I'm in control. I can go back. When I try to think about what would happen if, I try to focus my thoughts on that cycle, and trying to think through. I mean, obviously this cycle is drawn up for an upland situation. I'm trying to translate that in my mind for a wetland or a bog situation. I don't know. I'm kind of. I think a lot of it's going to go back to fire severity, obviously. But you can argue these things both ways. You can argue them both ways depending on how those different fluxes are affected. You go for that one, Randy. I'm going to punt.
Okay. No, I don't think that the difference between the burning of a wetland versus burning the upland will have a dramatic effect on the response. I think they'll have similar responses, I guess is what I'm saying. Just because it's a wetland, unless you're affecting the water tables and things like that, you're not going to have an extra methylation that's occurring. If you burn a wetland and water tables go up because you're losing transpiration because you burned off the trees and the vegetation, then yeah, methylation could probably go up in that system and the downstream systems from that wetland, the lakes and rivers. So unless you dramatically change the hydrology as a result of the burn, I don't think you'd have any difference in response between an upland and a wetland. What do you think about that, Trent?
That's an awesome one. See, this is typical. You can, with these mercury things, you can come up with arguments for increases and decreases if you think hard enough. But I like Randy's. I didn't think of that idea of water table changes, and that would be a big deal if the water table changed.
So Randy, if you did run a prescribed fire through a wetland, that increase that you're speaking to, assuming all things are equal, you would see an increase, or at least a short-term increase, in the evolution of mercury either into the atmosphere or into the aquatic system. I mean, that you would anticipate that, correct?
Yeah, I think I would if you influence the water balance. If the fire influences the water balance, like it would, right, short term, then I would expect that you would see an increase in methylmercury production because the water table would increase a little bit or come closer to the surface, I guess, and you would obviously have some volatilizations of the atmosphere no matter if you're in uplands or a wetland. That wouldn't change.
Yeah. Okay, and I think we have time for maybe one more quick question here, which is our last one. Most of what you've been speaking to, I think, is largely dealing with mercury transport at the surface. So what about mercury transport to groundwater? Is that a significant concern at this time? And if not, do you expect this to be a concern in the future as mercury deposition continues?
There's not a lot of concerns about groundwater. one of the main reasons, and this point I think we hit home a couple of different times, is a result of the complex interaction that mercury has with carbon. And carbon doesn't infiltrate and go through soils very readily. It gets tied up with other carbon, and so when you dig in a soil or you dig in a sediment, most of the carbon's at the surface, and that's where also the mercury is. So not to say that there isn't mercury in groundwater, but it's because of where the carbon is at in our ecosystems that it's not a huge concern, because the mercury is tied up with that carbon. So when you get a drink out of your faucet at home or at the restaurant, you get a glass of water, you don't really see that there's a lot of yellow in that water, a lot of DOC. And that's a good thing, because if there was DOC and it was yellow, you wouldn't want to be drinking that water, because there would be mercury in it. But because groundwaters are clear, they have little carbon in them, they also have pretty much little mercury in them.
Okay, well, I think that's all the questions that were forwarded on to me. Certainly appreciate everybody's time here, and especially Randy and Trent. And I think with that, we'll conclude today's webinar. Thank you very much.
Charles, are you going to stay on for a bit here?